to welcome you all this lunchtime to the third seminar, is it third or fourth seminar in the International State Crime Initiative seminar series, organised by Saab Kassim, who is a doctoral student in the School of Law. Thank you so much, Saab, you're doing a superb job, and ably assisted by Louise. Thank you very much. Today we are really delighted to introduce Richard Cockett, who was a senior lecturer in history at London University, Royal Holloway, before joining the Economist newspaper, or magazine I should say. And Richard has been reporting on a range of different geographical regions, and for our Latin America, but for our purposes today, on Africa, and particularly in Sudan and Darfur, and in Burma, and particularly in relation to the Rohingya. And today, Richard's going to talk to us about patterns of conflict and genocide, and he's going to compare the genocides which are taking place in Sudan and in Burma. And we have a real interest at ISCI because we've been working very closely on the Rohingya in Burma. So this is what brought Richard into our sphere of interest and friendship. And we also have Louise Wise, who's working on, has just finished a doctorate on Darfur and genocide, or Sudan and genocide as she would extend it. So we're really delighted to welcome Richard here today to the, in fact, what I see is the fourth seminar in the series. So without any further ado, Richard, thank you very much indeed. We're just delighted to have you. And Richard will speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll open up the floor for questions and contributions for around 20-25 minutes.
Thanks, Penny. It's a delight to be here. As Penny mentioned, I was an academic for 10 years at London University, mainly at Royal Holloway and the LSE, and occasionally came over here for lectures and seminars, and even gave a few. So it's returning to somewhere I know quite well. Yes, so as Penny was saying, I'm having left academia, I then went off to join the Economist and been basically a foreign correspondent for 14 years, first in Latin America, then in Africa and the Middle East, and then lastly for 4.5 years in Asia, where I was based in Singapore. But soon after I arrived there, things began to change in Burma. I will call it Burma today for the sake of argument. The previously closed away under a very harsh and oppressive military regime. In the autumn of 2010, things seemed to start changing a little bit. Aung San Suu Kyi, the leader of the opposition, Nobel Peace Laureate, was released from house arrest. There were elections which were a tiny bit less restrictive than military regime elections usually are. And then in 2011, it became clear very quickly that things were happening, that there was a reform in the air, and then Hillary Clinton arrived at the end of 2011 to give these changes her imperial imprimatur, and after that things began to happen very, very quickly, with the result that there were landmark elections, free and fair elections last year, and the NLD won a landslide, and very soon, probably in about a month, a new president is going to take place, is going to ascend to office in Burma, appointed by the NLD. So it's been an extraordinary, rapid change in a very short amount of time. Now, when I was Africa editor of The Economist, I spent months and months, probably years in total, in Sudan, here in the Horn of Africa. And again, my timing was fortunate, well, professionally unfortunate for people involved in that. I arrived there just as news reached out into the West. This is in 2004, 2005, of the mass killings going on in the Darfur region of Sudan, which is this western region here. Khartoum is the capital. up to this time, the main point of interest for people covering Africa and Sudan was the conflict between South Sudan here and Sudan. Now they are two different countries. South Sudan ceded from Sudan in 2011, but when I arrived there, it was all one country, and for the sake of sort of simplification, it was a largely Arab-speaking Muslim north and a Christian African south, and the equator runs roughly there, which sort of divided the two parts of the country geographically, climatically, and in many other ways. So very soon after I arrived, I went off to Darfur to see what was happening, and then spent years and years really reporting on the conflicts of Sudan, and particularly in Darfur. And then before I left, I published a book on Sudan, which is this, which is called Darfur and the Failure of an African State. And then in the middle of 2010, I went off to Asia, thinking that now I'd be reporting on entirely new subjects, new countries, etc. But then when I went to Burma at the end of 2010 for the first time, very quickly I had a sense of hang on a sec, I've seen this somewhere before, and the parallels with Sudan were very obvious, and became much more kind of clear and obvious the longer I stayed in Burma, and that's what I really want to talk about today. So in other words, I don't compare the two countries just because I happen to have written a book on both countries, and this is the Burma book, which came out at the end of last year. The reason that I got interested in Burma so much was because there seemed to be very graphic and compelling parallels with Sudan. And of course, the other reason that these two countries are so well known in the other sense in the news over the past 10 to 15 years is that they've both been locations for mass killings and genocides. In the Sudan case in Darfur, and in Burma's case with the Rohingya to the west of the country here. So this is Rakhine State, and the Rohingya, about 1 million stateless Muslims, mainly live in this area here, now squashed up really against the border with Bangladesh. The capital of Rakhine State is acclaimed, now named Sitwe. Yeah, so that was really the locus for the mass killings there. That started in about 2012. So what I want to do today is to really just sort of compare the two cases and draw out the parallels between them, and to try and explore a little bit about what the two genocides, mass killings had in common, and doing that, in the process of doing that, perhaps try and tease out some sort of predictive mechanisms for these sort of genocides, looking at different countries and other countries with similar geographic, political, social circumstances as Sudan and Burma, so we can learn a little bit about and perhaps hope to better prevent or at least predict what's going to happen on similar scales in other countries. So, what are the similarities? Well, basically, the two countries, of course, have many things in common, and I think both of which have led to the mass killings and genocides in both countries. And I say mass killings and genocides in the plural because one of the important points I'm going to make today is that although we are very familiar with the genocide in Darfur, which roughly speaking took place in about 2003 to 2004, the peak of it, killings are still ongoing, but that's when most of the deaths are reckoned to total about 300,000 took place. And also in Burma against the Rohingya, that they are symptomatic, those instances, of wider conflicts and patterns of conflict and instability within the two countries. And by way of illustration, I think the most striking similarity between the countries is that they are basically colonial I call them artificial colonial confections, that basically the countries we know today are the legacies only of imperial British rule. And the other thing in common, of course, is that they were both part of the British Empire. They were both physically conquered by Victorian imperialists. But the important thing about both countries, as in most countries in the world, if you look up the failed state index at any time, you will find that about 3/4 of the most badly failed states in the world also have this in common, that they were artificial colonial confections, the territories invaded by European imperialists in the 18th and 19th centuries, and have basically never recovered. And what happens is that, in the case of Sudan, the British were involved in the imperial adventures in Africa, and they pushed down to Khartoum. General Gordon, you're probably familiar with the tales of Gordon of Khartoum. But basically, imperialism generated its own momentum. And once you've conquered one part of, say, Africa here, in order to secure that part of Africa for the empire, you then had to conquer more bits of the territories around to ensure that you had strict rule and guaranteed rule over the territories that you've conquered. So the British began with Khartoum and then pushed down into the territories south of the equator, into South Sudan, very different territories, as I've explained, and also to this much more desert, hot desert Saharan region in the Sahel, really, of what we now know as Darfur. Up to British rule, these had all been separate kingdoms. South Sudan in particular, Darfur in particular, and Khartoum and this part of the Red Sea coast as well. So British rule basically administered all this as one territory for the first time, thus creating, as I say, this artificial country of Sudan. Now, if you look at Burma, much the same thing happened. The British came into conflict with the Burmese kings, who used to rule in their capital in Mandalay in the early 1820s, because the Burmese kings, the Burmese Empire was pressing up against Britain's Indian Empire. They came into conflict over control of the border areas up here. And in 1824, the British decided to resolve this once and for all by invading the territories which we now know as Burma from here. And in a series of wars, 1824, the First Burmese War, they bit off chunks of Burma, expanding all the time into the heartlands. 1824, the First Anglo-Burmese War, 1850s, the Second Anglo-Burmese War, when they basically conquered the whole of the south of the country we now know and established a new capital at Rangoon, which is now Yangon. And then finally, in the 1880s, they decided to finally subdue the last resistance of the Imperial Burmese court, sent an army up to Mandalay here, beat the Burmese army in a battle in Mandalay, and then completed the whole of the capture of all the territories here. But now within, importantly, just like Sudan, within what we now know as the territory of Burma, the British then expanded beyond the Burman heartlands, which is sort of here, where the ethnic Burmans dominate, and conquered all the separate parts of what we now know as Burma, which is basically the ethnic minority regions all over the top here. So basically that's the Chin people to the west, the Kachin at the top, the Shan to the east, and then the Karen down here. They were nothing to do with Burmans. Indeed, they regard themselves as having very little in common with the Burmans. But it made administrative sense for the British to rule all this captured territory as one administrative unit. And the main reason for that is that they wanted a buffer against China, which is along here, all along Burma's eastern border. So both countries were really created in the same way. They're, as I say, colonial confections, colonial concoctions. And from the very beginning, because this was forced conquest, coercion, both states were run with a high degree of centralized military control, civil service control from the centre, always trying to exert control over peripheries that never wanted to be in the country in the first place. And this was true of Burma as it was of Sudan. And the fact is that both countries were made independent. Burma won its independence from the British in 1948, January 1948. Sudan was the first African country to win its independence from the British in 1956. But from the very moment of independence, both countries collapsed into civil war as the peripheries of the country tried to seize their chance to separate from the centre. So in Burma's case, in 1948, civil war instantly broke out between the Karen and the Burmans, the Shan, the Kachin, and basically they've been fighting each other ever since. The Karen, which started the civil war in 1948, that became, in about the early 2000s, the longest running civil war as it was known in modern history. If we switch to Sudan, same pattern, 1956, the moment the British left, the South Sudanese rebelled. They never wanted to be included in rule by Sudan and fought a 55-year civil war, which cost about 2 million lives against rule from the north. A peace agreement was finally signed in 2005, which gave the South the option of seceding, and then 6 years later, in 2011, they took that up, and in an overwhelming vote, 98% for secession, they split off from Sudan. So why is this important? Well, because I think you have to see both countries through the prism of an ongoing internal conflict, civil conflict, between the centre and the peripheries. And the centre, you can interpret this most importantly ethnically. The centre usually comprised of a dominant ethnic group, in this case the Nilotic tribes of the Nile. The Nile runs down through the centre of Sudan. And in Burma's case, the Burmans, about 60% roughly of the population, against all the other ethnic groups of the country, the Shan, Kachin, Karen, many others, Chin, Mon down here, and also the Rohingya over in this part of the country here. So I think the most important thing is that the killings in Darfur and Rakhine are symptomatic of a more generalised pattern of conflict. So you could, as I say, the conflict with the South Sudan probably cost about 2 million people. All the wars with the Burman army against the Chin, the Kachin, Chin, have probably cost hundreds of thousands of lives. They've also created hundreds of thousands, probably millions of refugees who have fled over the border to camps along the border with Thailand here. About 3 million Burmese now work in Thailand as basically indentured slaves on shrimp boats and food processing factories to get a job which they can't get in Burma. So I think that's one of the most important things. And one of the symptoms of trying to exercise this military control from the centre, trying to coerce the peripheries into this artificially created state. The symptoms of this was that none of the peripheries were ever granted any means of democratic expression. In both countries, governors were appointed to the various regions, but the governors have been appointed by the central state. They are usually of the ethnicity of the governing elite, Arabs here, and in Burma's case, Burmans. And their job is not to represent the people in whichever region, Darfur or the East or South Kordofan. Their job is not to represent the people who they rule over. Their job is to oppress the people who they rule over, to make sure they're not rebelling or seceding on behalf of the governing elite of the country. And that is still true today. In Burma, despite all the democratic reforms, one of the most glaring democratic deficits of the country is to this very day. All the governors of the various states all over the country in the ethnic minority areas are all appointed essentially by the central government in Naypyidaw, the Burmans. a cause of enormous resentment. And it's not only that. The governors are appointed by them. The district officers who do the kind of minute, the administration on the ground, they are all appointed by the centrally appointed governor as well, and they all tend to be Burmans, and they all tend to be military officers. So the consequence of this in both countries is that there is no expression, there is no mechanism for local grievances to be aired. There is no mechanism, essentially, for reconciling different views between a governing majority and a governed ethnic minority. And this is the sort of system that they inherited from the British. And if I go and talk to a Sudanese person and say, well, this is ridiculous, you can't expect to oppress these people, hundreds and hundreds of miles away from Khartoum, you must give them some sort of representation, and the instant answer they will give is, well, you never did, as in they know I'm British. That's how you ruled the country, we're just doing what you did. To which I don't really have a very solid answer. I sometimes say, well, we hope we've moved on over the past 60 years. But basically what they're doing is they're inheriting the mechanisms and enforcing the mechanism of what they learned from the colonialists, and you'll get exactly the same answer in Burma as well. So that's the general administrative ethnic background to these things. And so neither genocide is isolated, it's symptomatic of wider structural problems in the state. Now, all these problems are compounded by what I would call ignorance, or more often willful ignorance, which basically means people at the centre in Khartoum. I call Sudan a one-city state. The dominance, this is the largest country, or was before it split up, the largest country geographically in Africa. But essentially, only one place matters, only one place has spent any money on itself. All the oil revenues, they all go to Khartoum, and a tiny bit of kind of irrigated agricultural land just south of Khartoum. But people in Khartoum know nothing of what happens in the rest of the country, and they don't care. But it's more than that, they take great trouble not to care. Some people have called Khartoum the selfish city of Africa, and I think that's a very good description. They just actually don't want to know about what goes on in Darfur or South Kordofan or the Blue Nile. And indeed, in these sort of dictatorial states with strong military governments, etc., of course, there's blanket censorship, all news is very tightly controlled. So even if you wanted to find out what's going on in the rest of the country, it's very difficult. And if we switch to Burma, again, the Burmans here in the centre and in Yangon and Naypyidaw, they've been involved in their own struggle for democracy for 30 years, the struggle between Aung San Suu Kyi and the National League for Democracy and the military government. That has been, of course, an absorbing and a very kind of news-orientated, world-famous struggle between the icon of democracy against the military government. But that's meant that the Burmans have been entirely self-absorbed in their own struggle, ignoring completely what's happened on the periphery of the country, the 40% or so of the other people who inhabit the territory, who have endured most of the oppression, the killing, the famine, etc., imposed upon them by the Burmese army. And to this day, you'll find very little knowledge. I say very little, no knowledge, I think, is a better description of the Kachin or how anybody lives on the periphery of the country, particularly the Rohingya in the west, of which people know nothing except, apart from the fact that they are Muslims. And I think that has really helped the process of genocides in both countries, because there's no sort of mechanism for anyone, even if people were well-intentioned, there's no real mechanism to find out about what's happening, that mass crimes are being committed. I mean, when I went to Sudan, to Khartoum, when Darfur was at the height of the killings in, say, 2005-06, I could find almost nobody who knew what was happening in Darfur. And nobody had certainly ever been there. They thought, they'd vaguely heard there was some rumpus out there, but they assumed this had all been concocted by the West. They really did, for Western geopolitical purposes. So it's very, very hard to argue with people, discuss with people what is going on in these places. They know absolutely nothing about it and are completely prejudiced against the people involved in the peripheries of their own country. So, I mean, it's a case of literally out of sight, out of mind. I mean, the other thing to bear in mind in these countries is that it's very, very, very difficult to travel anywhere in the country. The geography is against you, the transport networks are terrible in both countries. There are few rails and roads left from colonial times, but nothing was built from the 1940s or 50s onwards. So even if you were curious and you wanted to find out what was going on in, say, Chin State, Rakhine State, or Darfur in Sudan, it's almost impossible to do so. I mean, I have some instances of this in my book. I mean, it used to take about 10 days of very, very determined travel to get from the capital of Darfur, here, to Khartoum. You had to, endure sandstorms, etc., along the way. People did that to go to the University of Khartoum, and they'd stay a year and then go back and travel with their families. But it's almost impossible to travel. The connections between Sudan and South Sudan were pretty well non-existent, except if you were in the army. So again, I think geography is important, is an important aspect of this. But unless the state organises links between these parts of the country, nobody can experience or know or see what's happening. So when we talk about these genocides, etc., I mean, it is very state-orientated, state-organised, the response to these conflicts, because basically almost nobody else knows about it, travels there, or can mobilise against these sort of crimes, even if they wanted to. Now, moving on, the other part I want to talk about is ethnic conflict. As I've already said, these countries, these states are confections. And what has happened, basically, is that once they were all bundled into the same state, the differences between them, between the different ethnicities of the state, have become more emphasised rather than lessened through being in the same states. And we come back to another symptom or another sort of feature of colonial rule, divide and rule. In both countries, the governing elites learned very early on that a good way of maintaining rule was to split the opposition. And in these sort of countries, the best way to split opposition is to divide the opposition up along ethnic lines. And this is exactly what's happened in both countries. So basically, these, the administrators of both countries, let's take Sudan first, they, in Darfur, for instance, Darfur had been a bastion of the opposition party called the Umma Party to the ruling elites in Sudan. So what the ruling elites did to eliminate the opposition or diminish the opposition was basically to divide Darfur up administratively, this is in the 1970s, into various kind of regional districts, provinces, under the cover of modernization. So they would sell this as a project of modernization. Look, you're getting a modern administrative system. What they were doing, in fact, was to carve out little regions of ethnic conclaves. So the tribes all roughly got their little regions, and the African tribes, the Arab tribes, etc., which basically made any unified opposition to the centre impossible, because what they were then encouraged to do was to compete for resources with each other in Darfur, thus sharpening ethnic conflict. And you can see that also in Burma, where the, again, inherited from colonial times, in the 1980s, 1989, the government, the Burman government, came out, produced this famous list, 135 ethnic peoples, they decided there were 135 ethnic groups in Burma. Nobody knew where this came from. All we could find, all the people could find at the time, was an ancient British list where the first anthropologists came that had produced this magic number, 135. And so what they decided was that there were 105 legitimate ethnic groups within Burma who would have some rights. Probably, this was produced by Ne Win, who was one of the dictators. He was a great believer in the stars. He regularly consulted an astrologer on important political decisions. It's usually considered that the number 135, his favourite name, his lucky number was 9. And of course 1 through 5, 1 plus 3 is 4, plus 5 equals 9. So it's usually held that the only reason Burma has 135 nationalities is because his astrologer said it has to be 135 that add up to 9. Crucially, this 135 did not include the Rohingya. So the Rohingya in the West were considered to be immigrants into Burma rather than indigenous ethnic races. So the ethnic races, the Shan, the Kachin, they were acknowledged at least to have been indigenous to the country. The Rohingya were excluded from that list of 135 because they, in the Burman opinion, all come as immigrants from Bangladesh. So they had no protection in terms of legal rights or civil rights under the constitution after the 1980s. I think this has been very important in both countries because what it basically did was to make people extremely aware of their ethnicities. It dissolved and destroyed any notion of a united Sudanese or Burman national consciousness or national purpose, and made what eventually happened in Darfur and Rakhine state much easier. Now, another common theme, I think, in both countries, and this is very important, is crucially, I think, in both cases, the perpetrators of the genocide in Darfur and Rakhine state saw themselves as victims. I think this is a very crucial link, and this was used to justify their actions. So this is where the looking glass world of these countries, we regard the perpetrators of these crimes in Darfur as war criminals, etc. They regard themselves as victims. And it's the same in Burma. The people who have mainly carried out the killings of the Rohingya here are the Arakanese, as they were once called, were in Rakhine, now we call them the Rakhine, the people who lived here since the 10th or 13th century. Now, so it's this state here. Now, this used to be a separate kingdom, an independent kingdom in medieval times of Arakan. And this used to be one of the major kingdoms of Southeast Asia. It had a flourishing port. The Arakanese traders and sailors went all the way down the African coast by the Gulf trading. So it was a flourishing seaborne trading empire. They were invaded by the Burmans in 1784, before the British invaded. So that's their first grievance, that they're victims of Burman oppression, and indeed of Burman, they would call it a genocide themselves, because many Arakanese were killed, hundreds were taken off to act as slaves and forced warriors to the Burman court of Mandalay. So that's the first. Secondly, they were then invaded by the British, because they were closest to Britain's Indian Empire. So all the invasions of Burma happened via the Arakan here, the Arakan state. So from then on, they were victims of British oppression and colonial oppression. Thirdly, they were then victims of the mass immigration into their state of Bangladeshis. And they all came in from the district which was then known as Bengal, this vast area here. Now it's Bangladesh. Bengal, which used to be, of course, the capital was Calcutta, which is just down here, the original capital of Britain's East Indian Empire. And from the 1820s, 1830s, hundreds of thousands of people from Bangladesh began to flow into Rakhine State, into Arakan. The border was open here. There was no border because Burma, the conquered territories, were now part of Britain's Indian Empire. So they had three grievances. They'd been conquered by the Burmans, then they'd been oppressed and conquered by the British, and then they'd been swamped, in their own word, and it's a word they use often, and overrun by the Bengalis, the Bangladeshis, the people who we now call the Rohingya. So when they turned on the people who'd come amongst their midst, uninvited, brought in by their colonial oppressors, the British and indeed the Burmans in the 19th century, they were not consulted. These Bengalis took all their jobs. They claimed that they took all their land. So when they revolted in 2012 and drove all the Rakhine in one go, in 2 bouts of ethnic cleansing out of the capital, Seattle, in 2012, what they were doing in their own minds was reclaiming their birthright, reclaiming their land from their colonial oppressors and from their oppressors, be them Burmans, Bengalis, Brits. They're all lumped together. So these people see themselves as victims of violence, of conflict, of colonial oppression, not as perpetrators. And if you go and talk to, as the state crime, if you go and talk to representatives of the Rakhine parties, people who have been involved in the ethnic cleansing, etc., you can talk for about 2 or 3 minutes about why are you so violent towards the Rohingya, why are you persecuting them so much? And almost before you've got beyond the question, they immediately say, wait a sec, what about our persecution? Why aren't you talking about how we've been persecuted? What about our losses? What about the invasion of our lands? Etc., etc., etc. It's very hard to get them back on to the persecution of Rohingya. Because to them, what they're trying to do is to reclaim the old kingdom of Arakan, which is their birthright, which is where they live, before it was all upset by all the invaders and the immigrants. So I think that's terribly important. And it is and it's a fact that, and again, I think that has a lot of common with other instances of mass genocide. I'll just, just to take 2 examples. The Boers in South Africa and the implementation of apartheid after the Second World War from 1948 onwards. Again, it was very difficult to argue with Boers that there was anything wrong with apartheid because they saw themselves primarily as victims. They were victims of British colonial oppression. So in their own history, their history is not one of oppressing indigenous black groups in South Africa. Their history is one of fighting great battles against the British who were trying to drive them out of the lands that they'd originally occupied in South Africa in the early 18th century. Their foundation myth is what they call the Great Trek, which was when the Boers all emigrated from the Cape up to the lands around what is now the Transvaal and around Johannesburg. And so what made it so hard to argue with the Boers was precisely that they saw themselves as victims. So the minute you start arguing, well, what about your awful treatment of the other races, etc., they would say, well, how's it? What about the awful treatment of our race? They were subjected to the first concentration camps. During the Boer Wars of the British against the Boers, the British, to try and stop the Boer guerrillas, constructed these camps, and they forced all the Boer women and children into these camps to try and cut off the Boer guerrillas from their means of support. These were the original concentration camps. What about that? What about the great crimes perpetrated against us? And just another instance, of course, the other one often cited is Nazi Germany, where again the Nazis really saw themselves primarily as victims. And this was the whole thing of the stab in the back after the First World War, how the Jews had infested the German blood and had, sapped their vitality during the First World War, and that's why they'd lost, etc., etc. So I think that sense of victimhood is very important. 2 last points, but I'm coming to the end. The other point in both countries is domestic politics, I think, is vital. We've already discussed the internal divisions of within Darfur state. Again, I think this is very important because these divisions, which are there, ethnic divisions, they can be managed, they can be reconciled, or they can be exploited. And in both countries, Sudan and Burma, they have been expertly exploited by the ruling elites for their own purposes of staying in power. So to take the Rakhine state first, Muslims in Burma have always been unpopular since colonial times, and that's mainly because Buddhist Burmans, the majority, view all Muslims in the country as illegal immigrants, interlopers, brought in by the British to run Burma during the 19th century. So they regard all Muslims, and there are probably maybe as many as 5 million Muslims in Burma today. Very few of them have any rights, passports, or allowed to call themselves Burmans. They are regarded as illegal immigrants. Now, when Burma began to change recently, after 2011-2012, and it became obvious that if left to themselves, the Burman voters would all vote for Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD in the election last year. The governing party, the military party, USDP, President Thein Sein, their strategies hit on the only electoral card really they had left, which was to whip up ethnic and religious antagonism against the old enemy, the Muslims. So they thought that if they could unite the Burmans in a sort of froth of anxiety against the continuing influence, growth of the Muslim population, the foreign invading population, then they might have a chance of surviving at the election in 2015, at the end of last year. So again, the ethnic killings here, the genocide in Rakhine State has to be seen in that context. And the State Crimes Initiative itself has documented in detail how these ethnic killings, they were partly spontaneous, but they were also partly organised, because they were part of a wider strategy of isolating Muslims, identifying themselves as the enemy of the Burman Buddhist majority who are in the heartlands here. And the fact is that, as is well documented, even Aung San Suu Kyi, who got the Nobel Prize for Peace, etc., and many awards for human rights, felt unable to speak up ever on behalf of the Rohingya, because she thought, too, that if she spoke up against the Muslims in the Rohingya, she would jeopardize her own chances of becoming president or the NLD winning the election last year. So not only did she not intervene in the conflict here, she can't even mention the Rohingya by name. She's never mentioned the Rohingya by name, because for the Burman Buddhists, if you name them Rohingya, that gives them a separate ethnic identity on a par with the Kachin or the Shan or whatever else it may be, rather than, as they want them to be named, Bengalis. Every Burman calls these people Bengalis, because that identifies them as illegal immigrants from Bengal. So just the name is so important. One name gives them a specific identity, ethnic identity, on a par with other ethnic groups. The name the Burmans choose to call them by, Bengalis, gives them some no status, and it signifies immediately that they are illegal immigrants from what used to be Bengal. Now it's the same very much here in Darfur. Darfur is roughly speaking divided into the Arab tribes and what we would call the African Sudanese Darfur tribes, the Thor being one of them. And what Khartoum did to repress rebellions here was to use and pay the Arab tribes here to oppress the Africans. There had always been conflict between the two over grazing rights, pastoral land. It is a semi-arid part of the world here. The only fertile bits are the occasional mountains or round mountains, and Gerald Mara in the middle here is one of them. And what Sudan did was to encourage the conflict between them so as to keep more political control and prevent any opposition coalescing into a successful armed uprising. And that's essentially what burst out in 2003. The armed mercenaries, they were paid and equipped by the Sudanese armed forces, became known as the Janjaweed, probably familiar to you all, and they were basically the armed mercenaries of the Sudanese armed forces, the Arab tribes now paid to terrorize and drive the African tribes out of their usual watering, their usual fertile lands and their homes and villages in the more fertile bits of the country. And the Arabs were rewarded with land, with grazing rights, etc., all enforced by the Sudanese military. So that's why I think, again, politics is very important. They're usually symptoms, these mass killings and genocides, of wider structural problems, wider impositions of rule on the rest of the country. Now, lastly, I'm just going to end with the international response. And sadly, and this is probably the most unfortunate similarity of the two cases, both ethnic cleansings or genocides, in my view, were allowed to happen. They both happened in plain sight of the world. And they were both allowed to happen because decision makers, the international community, had geopolitical purposes, geopolitical reasons to allow both genocides to happen in the belief that there was some greater gain at stake, some greater prize which would be jeopardized if they spoke out or tried to prevent the mass killings. Take Sudan first. In Sudan, the Sudanese government became a vital ally in 2002-2003 of the Americans and the British in the first stage of the war against terror, and Osama bin Laden. Crucially, in the 1990s, Osama bin Laden had been invited to Sudan. He lived in Sudan from the mid-1990s onwards for about 5 or 6 years. He was invited there by the leader of the Sudanese Islamist movement, Tarabi. And so when he drove those planes in between 2000 and 2001, the first place the CIA and the MI6 came to for information was Khartoum, because they assumed that Khartoum had trained him. Tarabi had basically was the godfather of Al-Qaeda. He had given Osama bin Laden the training facilities, the farms, etc., around Khartoum, north of Khartoum, where Al-Qaeda originally trained on. So they immediately came to Khartoum and basically said to the government, you cooperate with us, you tell us, you give us your bin Laden file, or else. And it so happened that the head of Sudanese intelligence there, a man called Salagosh, had been assigned to be Osama bin Laden's, if you like, gatekeeper and companion when Osama bin Laden initially got off the plane from Saudi Arabia back in 1996. So basically, through British and Americanized in particular, Sudan became not genocidal maniacs running amok in South Sudan, etc., but the key ally in the war against terror, which, as you'll all remember, in the 2000s was the major concern for Western governments and intelligence agencies. So when the Darfur region, when the rebellions and the warfare, the conflict sharpened up in 2004-2005, the 2003-2004, that was at the high point of the cooperation between Khartoum, the intelligence service and the army, and the Western security agencies. So when the Sudanese armed forces began to push back against the rebels and embarked on this a year's long's worth of campaign to drive people out of their villages in 2003-2004, committing basically some genocide then, this was all photographed in satellites going over Darfur, so you could see what was happening pretty well in real time. And MI6 and CIA, our government, had all these photos, and they were shown indeed to UN agencies there. But the few people who bothered to inquire said, well, why don't we do something about it? And they were always said, well, there's a wider picture here, there's a bigger game involved. What that basically meant was that the deal was Khartoum kept on giving all their intelligence to the British and the Americans about Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, and in exchange for that, we were going to look the other way in Darfur. And that's what happened. And that happened for a year, by which time 300,000 people had been killed. The UN administrator at the time, Mukesh Kapila, he's documented this, and in the end he spoke out, he went public on the media, because nobody in his own agency or in either government wanted to speak out. Nobody wanted to jeopardize the cooperation over Osama bin Laden. And also in the South, they wanted the peace deal with the South more than they wanted to reconcile anything in Darfur. And if we go to Burma, roughly the same things happened in Burma. Again, the timing of the ethnic cleansings in Sittwe 2012, this was, as I say, partly because they wanted to try and reinforce their legitimacy amongst the Burman Buddhists. And again, it's happened in plain view. You've all seen pictures of it. It was very well documented. I would say we all wrote about it, etc. And of course, over the years, it's just got worse and worse. All the Rohingya have been herded into dreadful prison camps, basically prison camps, called concentration camps, really, cut off from their livelihoods, from any means of communication with the rest of Burma, forced to flee in flimsy old boats to the rest of Southeast Asia, and hundreds died doing so. And this goes on. Now, why does this go on? Because, again, there's a bigger game at stake. Particularly for the Americans, again, and the British, if you protested against too vigorously, or trying to sanction the government too vigorously about what was going on in Rakhine State against the Rohingya, then you risked losing the bigger democratic transformation of Burma. Basically, you had to have the cooperation of the military government to reform, to democratically reform, and the fear was that if you took a big stick to them about what was happening over here, then they would stop reforming, they would become uncooperative about the democratic reforms in the rest of the country, and that would jeopardize this great opening up of Burma, which Hillary Clinton, in particular, had invested a lot of her political capital in during her time as Secretary of State. So I find particularly responsible for what happened there is two women, Aung San Suu Kyi, who didn't say anything about it, and Hillary Clinton, who just ignored it in the hope that she would get more plaudits for the wider game of bringing democracy to Burma. So again, in both cases, I'm afraid the Darfuris and the Rohingya have been victims of bigger geopolitical games. And that's another lesson, I'll end on that, is usually that all these things happen for a reason, and in the modern world, it's very hard for all these sort of things to happen out of sight and unknown to the rest of the world. And so they're happening and they're not being prevented because, again, for a reason. So, these are the structural circumstances of both these horrific genocides. And I'll stop there.
Well, Richard, thank you very much. I mean, that was really fascinating, particularly for those of us at the International State Crime Initiative who've separately looked at these genocides. And I think that we can learn so much from comparisons, from looking at the same. It's very clear that the same patterns, the same structural drivers are at work in creating these horrendous conditions for certain groups of targeted people. So I'm going to open up now for questions and contributions.
Yeah. Hey, this is Bhargav Reddy. I'm from School of Politics and International Relations.
Yeah.
What's your take on the complicit nature of the monastery and the monks involved in the so-called genocide, as you were explaining? Yeah. So do you think they are fueled by the military regime for their own political gains, or are they driving their own idea of spreading so-called Buddhism?
Yes, this is for those who don't know the monks of Burma, the holy men, about 700,000 probably in Burma have. Some of their number have been implicated in these crimes in egging people on to commit genocide. They are the cheerleaders often, and there's one particular organisation called the Mabata, which is an organisation of the Sagang, of the monkhood in Burma, But and the leader of that is a particularly notorious monk called Uwiratu, who you might have heard of, and he's been accused of basically being a cheerleader for these crimes. And I think the links between the military and these monks is well established. Again, I think the military regime, when they wanted to rally political support, of course, the monks are the most respected people in Burma. They needed the support of the monks. And I'm afraid to say that Buddhist monks in Burma are as racist and as discriminatory, sectarian as some of the worst people of the military. Uwaratu is a very good example of that. Buddhism is not necessarily about peace and love. For the Mabata, it's basically about hatred of the Muslims, virulent, nasty hatred of Muslims, and all based on the politics of fear. They fear the country is going to be taken over by Muslims. They fear that the religion is going to sweep Buddhism out of Burma, etc., etc. So yeah, no, I think the links are very clear. Indeed, the Americans have sanctioned one or two politicians with particular links to the Mabata for encouraging the monks to collude. I mean, when I was in Sittwe, after these ethnic cleansings, or the day or two after the second bout, they had a huge demonstration in the middle of the town. Hundreds and hundreds of really nasty mobs. So they just cleansed all the Muslims from the town, and the mosques were still burning and the houses were still burning. And there was a huge procession through the town because the Red Crescent, the Muslim Red Crescent, an aid organisation, they just heard that the Red Crescent wanted to set up an office outside Sittwe to help the Rohingya victims. So they organised this big rally to protest against the Muslim intervention here, another Muslim invasion of their holy Buddhist land. And that march was organised and stewarded by monks who had big signs up all saying death to Muslims, etc. And they were organising, they were stewarding it, and they were at the front of it. So they were very plain, and so I'm afraid there, the monks reflected, I mean, they are in the end, they are nothing more than the people of the area in the end. They have shared the same prejudices, the same hatreds, etc. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you for the insightful presentation.
Thank you.
Both countries.
Yeah.
By the way, I'm one of those who you interviewed
yes.
long time ago.
That's right.
I'm
yeah.
Spanish from
yeah.
Darfur. I'm also visiting for at Cornell Institute for African Development.
Right.
You are right about the similarities actually between Burma and also between Sudan, in particular Darfur. But there is one difference actually between the two countries. Darfur is not a minority. Darfur right now one of the biggest majority actually of Sudan. That's for sure. And the root cause of this conflict is this issue of crisis of governance. And that's why, without actually addressing, the issue of governance in the country so that you can restructure the institutions actually in the country, there will be no solution for Darfur or for the other places. One of the problems actually the definition of the crisis itself, and that actually the international community collaborated with the Sudanese government actually in the center to just define Darfur as a tribal thing. And that actually well said with the sometimes Western mentality is everything in Africa just like a tribal kind of thing or something like that. So the definition of the problem actually, that is one of the things that actually failed all the attempts to resolve the crisis of political means since 2004 or something like that. So that one of the things that I think are very important actually to be addressed. So therefore it's not a matter of, even the Janjaweed actually, they are not representing all the other groups actually, Darfur, that's for sure. And by the way, Darfur and the Sultanate of Fon or Sennar were the founding actually bones of the current Sudan. That I think, because Darfur actually Sultanate reached until Omdurman right now, the capital actually of the country or something like that. So therefore, one of the biggest majority actually in the country, and actually it need to be involved in that way. I just want you to, on the issue of international response. The international community, they said, yes, I agree with you on the issue of collaboration on war of terror, and also the issue of resolving the South Sudan, and really they betrayed Darfur and they betrayed Sudanese completely. But the thing is actually the crime there, genocide and crimes against humanity and all of them are international crime. I cannot just resolve them in Sudanese context or something like that. So they need some sort of intervention because the humanity has some sort of legal obligation, a moral obligation actually to respond. But all the intervention cases actually, I think they are not like very, successful ones, in Libya, in Iraq, and Afghanistan, all this kind of. But at the same time, also you need, the international community to respond. So I want you to elaborate on what kind of intervention that actually we need to respond to this kind of crisis like genocide in Darfur and others. What are the criteria for successful humanitarian intervention? Thank you.
Little question. Yeah. I'll just say very quickly on that. I mean, a couple of two concrete things. In Darfur, there was one very simple way of preventing the killings from continuing on a large scale, and that was to ground the Sudanese armed forces helicopters. They had these famous Antonov attack helicopters, usually crewed by Ukrainians, and they would sweep into these villages and kill most of the people even before the Janjaweed had arrived. And the simple way of doing that was to enforce a no-fly zone over Darfur. Now this was seriously considered by the Americans and the French and the British, particularly 2006, 2007. It would have been a fairly clean solution to the problem. I think that probably would have led to further constructive interventions. In the end, for a variety of reasons, that didn't happen. But this is the thing about intervention. Some interventions can be successful, others are disastrous, and that sort of clinical, very limited, precise intervention in Darfur, I think, could have been successful. In Rakhine State, I think one of the Penny in the State Crimes Initiative, a big contribution to this would just be to report what's happening. I mean, I'm appalled by the UN in Rakhine State, which just doesn't report